Let's talk for a minute about overly this and overly that. I've been wanting to understand the following verse we're going to look at a little better lately. The verse is Ecclesiastes 7, verses 16 to 18, says, "Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all." So I'd concluded in what little bit of studying I'd done so far on that it relates to this other verse here. Somehow, some way it relates to this verse. In Colossians 2, verses 16 through 19, Paul says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that's from God." So in the meantime, as I'm thinking about that verse, about not letting anybody judge you, new moon, Sabbath, and growing and holding fast to the head, I was studying about growing itself. I decided I wanted to study about growing. And it led me right back to Colossians 2:19 again, the very few uses of the word growth in the New Testament, especially relating to us as individuals. And surprisingly, one of them was that very verse. So understanding that verse there in Colossians is going to help us with what's this overly stuff we're talking about. And it's going to give us a little knowledge about how to grow once we understand this verse. So here in Ecclesiastes 7, let's go back to it. We've already read, and let's look at Solomon's words. He said, "Don't be overly righteous." In verse 16, he said, "Don't be overly wise." In that same verse, he said, "Don't be overly wicked." In the following verse. And it turns out there were two original words involved there for that overly statement. The verse 16 and 17 in the white text were this original word here that said to increase, there's an abundance and things of that nature, to enlarge and excel. And the latter part of verse 16 for being wise used this word of being redundant, if you will, over and above, more, profit, things of that nature. So I think we see, hopefully that helps us start to understand what that phrase is supposed to mean. Over what it needs to be. Beyond. It's too much. It's not the right amount, if you will, too much. So we see going too far. We need to be righteous. He's not saying don't be righteous. We need to be wise. He's not saying don't be wise. And sadly, we will commit wickedness. We're going to commit some wickedness. But it says don't overdo any of these. Don't continue, for example, in wickedness that grace may abound. Be as dead to wickedness and sin as you possibly can be. When it comes to righteousness and wisdom, though, we can take it too far. Paul's verse we're going to see in a minute is going to help us understand this. The Colossians verse we already looked at. The answer was at the end of Ecclesiastes, and the same answer is in Colossians 2, something that helps us here. Ecclesiastes ended, the last part of the verse, "For he who fears God will escape them all." Fearing God is what's involved here. So we want growing, not too much, just right. Let's look at that. Sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? Growing, not too much, just right. Here we have, in Paul's verse we read in Colossians, we had a guy who was saying, don't do this. And he was saying, you need to do that. And he's saying you need to fast. And it wasn't an example in that verse, but we have people saying you need to be celibate. And you don't need or shouldn't be eating this. And he says you did this and you didn't do that. He's telling everybody these things is what that person was doing. And Paul said in Colossians, don't let someone do that to you. Don't let someone do that to you. He said, this person is not seen clearly, is what he said. Because if you remember, what we already learned from Solomon in Ecclesiastes was, he who fears God is going to escape all these things that he's worried about and fretting about. What we need to do is look over here is what Paul said in Colossians. There's a head and there is a body. which is the church, we find out. And hopefully you are a saint in that church. And Paul's language is like there's joints and there's ligaments holding us to the head, and it's nourished and it's knit together. And not only that, it's growing. It's growing right. And all that's going to be taken care of just by doing the right things there. And finally, on this guy does not hold fast to that head. He's looking at these other things and not looking at the head for what he needs, or God. But here we see Paul said in that verse, hold fast to the head, and you are part of the body that grows with a growth that's from God. So all these other things will be taken care of if you're focusing on the head and the body. So we finish reading here. If Colossians goes on from what we read, and he said, verse 20, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they're used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. The things that guy was saying are not going to help. Not going to help is what Paul said. So this, even with all this information, we've spent quite a bit of time already, it's still a little hard to grasp. But a lot of information. Be dead to sin and wickedness is something we learned there. Be dead to it. Don't overly wicked. Do as little as possible. None if you could. Be righteous and wise. Nitpicking with fleshly rules is not the answer. Fear God, hold fast to the head, and grow with the body, the church. That's what you need to do. Fear God, like Solomon said, and Paul, and hold fast to the head. Grow with the body of the church. That's what's needed to put to death your earthly passions.